I don't really do any intro. We'll just get started talking because there's a lot to talk about. But I should introduce myself to you first because this is the first episode that I've done with someone that I didn't know. So I forget that you don't know me either. So my name's Sika, and I'm fine with you calling me that. And I don't know. This is the third episode of this podcast that we're recording. None of the episodes have been uploaded yet. So after this one, I'll start uploading them. So this is kind of like a milestone, I guess. And I contacted you initially because I can't remember if I said this when I contacted you or not, but because I read your fic, An Algorithm for Mistakes. Mistakes. And I probably should have read more before I was like, hey, let me contact this person, but I don't know. I just liked it so much. I was like, oh my God, I gotta talk to her. So there's that, and then I've been like kind of going through your Tumblr after we already said that we were going to do the podcast, and like trying to, I guess, find out stuff about sort of where you stand on stuff, and it's very interesting. So there's a lot of questions from that too. But I guess my first question is, what is, I guess, kind of introduce yourself and maybe what your fan experience is, like what's your primary mode of participating in fandom? Is it writing fic? Is it doing videos? Is it blogging, et cetera, et cetera? Go ahead. That'll be it.
Okay, sure. I'm Fleete. I've been in fandom for, maybe 15 years now. I remember I've been a lurker for a really long time. I was really too nervous when I was in high school and like the early part of college to write anything, even though I really wanted to. I was just too shy and I was terrified that it would be terrible. So I didn't start writing fan fiction until 2 years ago, basically. And I was really glad that I did because suddenly I was participating in fandom where I hadn't before. I was actually making friends, and I started out baiting, and then I wrote fic. And then I've tried a couple other things. Like I've tried my hand at iconing, if iconing is a verb, and doing little bits of like graphic art, and podfic. But mostly I've been writing fic.
Cool. So that's actually later than I expected. I guess a big part of this podcast is that it's really easy to assume that my fan experience is the same as most other people's. But like for myself, I started like reading fic and just being a part of fandom probably. It had to be middle school at some time. So, like, when I was, like, 11 or 12. And so I assume that everyone has that sort of time span of, like, they were into it when they were, like, preteens and teens. And then now they're sort of older and taking it more seriously, I guess. But it's interesting that you were still, like, sort of lurking in high school and early college, because I think that time was when I had, like, a sort of 2-year span of not reading fan fiction or, like, not doing anything in fandom at all, because I kind of wanted to feel older. It seemed like this thing that, like, oh, I've put it away now, you know. So you're in graduate school.
Yeah, tail end of graduate school.
Okay, so what exactly is are you getting your master's?
I'm getting my PhD.
Okay, so you already have your master's. What was your master's in?
English.
Oh, okay, well that makes sense then. So you already had some sort of writing experience, or at least interest, before you started writing fic?
Yeah, well I had academic writing experience. Come to find out that creative writing requires a different skill set, I think.
What?
Related, but different.
Elaborate on that.
There were so many things that I didn't, that I had to learn, like really basic things like show, don't tell, and how to figure out things like narrative tags and description. I learned that I had a very, I have a tendency to set up my sentences in the same way every time. I'm trying to learn to vary those. It works really well for academic papers because it leads to clarity, bang, 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 the end.
Right. So would you say that, so you started writing fic at the end of college, possibly, or?
I was, a couple of years into graduate school, and it's been a couple of years since then.
Because I'm just thinking, you have not like as not hundreds of fics, but you do have like a good chunk of fiction that you've already completed, and to me, writing always takes so much time, and that's why it's like sort of overwhelming when I think, okay, I want to start this idea, that I think of how much time it's going to take to write it. But then I'm thinking, okay, well, what if I was like in graduate school, where obviously the amount of time that you have is drastically limited? How do you, is it sort of like a nice break from your schoolwork and the things that you have and those obligations, or is it just kind of an additional project that you have to think about that you're working on?
It's a nice break. It's also an excellent procrastination tool. That's mainly what I used it for. But it was also sometimes an additional project, when you're 15K into a fic that just keeps getting longer and you're like, I have to finish this by a deadline. But I kind of like that project-based, deadline-driven kind of writing.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I haven't participated in a lot of the like big bangs or challenges or any of that stuff where it actually has a deadline, which is one thing that I think was sort of influenced me to maybe try and get back into writing, because I feel like that wasn't there when I was initially into fandom. It seems to have gotten more, and I might be wrong about this, but it seems to have gotten more organized as far as writing productivity as a community in fandoms over the past couple of years.
I think those structures have been there for a while, like at least back into the 90s. You just had to be able to find them. And I think that they've proliferated a lot so that, you have those kinds of big bangs and writing communities in lots of different fandoms, and they're easy to find as opposed to you have to know where to go.
True. Very true. So do you have a set amount of I guess, what's the writing process like for you? Do you write every day? Do you, I know I've seen a couple of, you do writing exercises, but is that, something that you're really trying to get yourself to do all the time? Or, sort of, how do you keep your creative flow flowing?
Yeah. I'm pretty terrible. I'm still trying to figure this all out. I don't have a set time for writing, even for my dissertation, which I'm supposed to be working on. And I like doing little spurts, like 2010s, where you do 20 minutes of writing, 10 minutes of rest. I like doing tomatoes, which is 25 minutes of writing. All of these little tricks for getting little bits of writing out. I do Write or Die, which is a program that you can find online. There are lots of little chats that people set up where, you'll write for 30 minutes and then everybody will just chat for 30 minutes. Those kind of fandom-related writing chats.
That sounds awesome. I actually heard, are you into Buffy at all?
No.
Okay. Well, you don't really have to be to understand what I'm talking about, but Amber Benson, who plays Tara in Buffy, she was on a podcast and she was talking about how, and I don't know if you know, but she writes fiction now, kind of sci-fi fantasy stuff.
Yeah.
And she was talking about having a writing club where they would get up early and kind of the same thing where they would write for a while and then take a break for however long to sort of talk and just rest or whatever, and then write again. And I was thinking, I need something like that. But I live in a pretty small town, and so I was thinking, well, I don't know if I can find anyone. But it's good to know that that's online, too.
Yeah, the community spirit helps a lot.
What's Write or Die, just as a side note?
Write or Die is a program there. If you type in Write or Die into Google, you'll find it. There's a browser version and there's a desktop version, and you write into this little browser app directly into it, and it has different levels of motivation for you to keep going. So if you pause for a few seconds, like the screen will turn red, or it'll start making a really ugly noise at you, like babies crying, or dissonant violins, or beeping. You pick the level of anger, and so you can't stop writing. You have to keep going.
Oh, awesome. Okay, well, I've been trying to keep a note of everything that gets referenced in these podcasts for people who listen, so hopefully they can go and check that out. I know I will be. But,
yeah. I want to mention my other, hardcore program is Scrivener. Like, I'm a diehard Scrivener fan. I write everything in Scrivener.
How do you spell that?
Scrivener.
Aha. Okay. Saving that too. Okay, so, where to start? Let's see. You talk a lot about established relationships, and this is something I specifically wanted to bring up to you because, you obviously are very, pro-established relationships. I don't know, or maybe not pro, just sort of in defense of them, and, or in fic, this is what we're talking about. And, so kind of, without going too deeply into it, what is your, I guess, stance on established relationships?
My stance is that I really would like to figure out ways to make them interesting in fic to a wide variety of readers. And that can be hard because I think our default in fandom is the first time story. Like, it's the default for most kinds of storytelling, I think. And I hear a lot of people say things like, established relationships just aren't interesting. And I think that's not true. It's just that the fics you're reading don't make them interesting, I think there's some prejudice against established relationships. And now that I'm in one, like as an adult, I'm a lot more interested in them. I'm interested in ways to bring out the inherent conflicts and everyday, dynamics of those ships.
I'd be interested in seeing maybe how that compares, or how that's influenced by the demographics of people who read fan fiction, and also obviously that's different in each fandom. But, and I don't want to make assumptions here, but it seems like a lot of people would either not have been in a relationship yet. I feel like I'm already this is completely wrong to even assume, but or they're in maybe their first one or something like that. I don't know. Maybe that has something to do with it.
I don't know. Maybe the demographics are part of it. But I also know, older fans who are in their 40s and 50s who are also really strict fans of first-time fics. So I don't know. It's not necessarily like a movement, and I write lots of first-time fics, so I can't necessarily talk about this. I'm just interested in it, in how do I write established relationships that's interesting to me as a writer and interesting to readers.
Right.
I don't have answers to that.
Right. But. I mean, I don't think anyone really does quite yet, but I mean, it is interesting because I think it's not something that's just in fandom. It's in all types of writing and all types of storytelling. I remember I was in media studies or film production major in college, and on our first day of class talking about the history of cinema, our professor said if you want to make something that people are interested in, you need to write about people meeting for the first time or leaving each other. It's sort of like these moments where it's either the start of something or the beginning or the end of something. And so it's kind of well, how do you talk about all that stuff that goes on in the middle,
Yeah, and I think fandom is actually a good a good spot for exploring those dynamics because we already have all of this back knowledge of all of our characters going into the fic. So you can more often start in the middle. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I also, this is, I guess, just another theory, which I didn't expect myself to have so many theories on this, but possibly, and I'm just speaking for myself here because I tend to read rare pairs more often for some reason, and it seems like the most interesting part of that is seeing how do you take these characters which people normally don't think of as being together or as being interesting, their dynamics. How does this author work with that? And so it's kind of weird to come in the middle when you're, I don't know, you kind of know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think the reason it is important, or the reason I find it interesting, is that I've talked about this a lot with one of my friends, which hopefully she'll do the podcast soon. But fan fiction, especially when you're younger and reading it, gives you this sort of sometimes utopic idea of relationships, and this is the same as in like any love song or any like romantic movie or whatever. It's somewhat unrealistic, and just in that like when you get together with someone, that doesn't fix everything, and then all of a sudden everything's great, So it's kind of like it is important to go beyond that and see what would happen after you're already together, or after. How do you actually deal with this person in real life, aside from just being attracted to them and then consummating that in some way?
Yeah. I've liked a few fics I've read that, they start out with the first time, but then it's a longer fic and they develop into this sort of established relationship dynamic where they're exploring those questions of, they get together and it's great, and then they have more problems than they thought they did.
Right. So the other thing, I'm kind of skipping around a little bit here, but I did want to ask you, you were talking about on your live journal, I think you had posted something that someone was doing research, like fan studies research, and you mentioned a couple times the thing that you liked about it was that it was ethically done, like ethical fan studies.
Yes.
And so, of course, since I'm doing this podcast, that piqued my interest. And so I was wondering sort of how, or I guess what would you view as typically unethical that people usually are, as far as how people go about studying fan fiction and studying fandom and the things that surround that?
Yeah, so the thing with, so if you're doing academic research and talking to human beings and getting information from them, generally what you're going to have to do is get your research approved by the IRB at your school, and that's the I just blanked on what it stands for, but whatever.
Institutional, maybe?
Yes, it's the Institutional Review Board, and they review your research to make sure it meets ethical guidelines, except for IRBs a lot of them are still operating on an older method of where the lines are, that doesn't really account for the internet. Because for a lot of people, the thought is the internet is public. It's always public all the time. And if you put information on the internet, you should be anybody can come and take it, and you've made that available to them, and you can't do anything about it. However, and some IRBs are starting to develop better guidelines for this, along with the AOIR, the Association of Internet Researchers, put out a lot of good information about how to do this, about all of the spaces that are sort of more nebulous, like say you've got a forum for survivors of abuse, or a forum for people with a particular medical condition. It may be public, but it's also, you have to find it and you have to go there. you have to be looking for it in order to find it. And if you as a research go in there, grab information and publicize it, you're reshaping it and repackaging it for a different audience that it was never meant for. And you can also get into some really shady questions of, I've read a particular researcher's experiences. She was studying online teenage bloggers, which is, and generally speaking, if you want to talk to anybody under the age of about 17 with research, you need parental permission. But the internet makes it so you can get away with getting information from minors in the U.S. And she ended up doing research on like suicidal fixations among teenagers in their blogs. And if she was doing this with teenagers who she was talking to in real life, she would have to report those to authorities. But because she was doing this on the internet, it was a more nebulous line, and you get into some really sticky areas. And I think it needs a different set of guidelines that a lot of these research boards, review boards, haven't gotten there yet. They're not operating at the latest set of guidelines, which is, for me, the gold standard is whatever's put out by the AOIR.
So it kind of reminds me of, like, specifically after, like, for instance, after the Hunger Games, and there were all those racist tweets on Twitter, and and then it was like, I mean, there's been a bunch of different little incidents where suddenly you see all these screen captures of something that someone's posted in reaction to something, and while it might be offensive and racist and et cetera, it does sort of bring in that, like, question of, but how ethical is it to say, like, oh, well, I found out where this person goes to school or whatever, you guys should call the school and talk to them about it. I don't really have an answer to that, because on one hand, it's sort of like, well, what this person said is harmful to others or possibly harmful to themselves, and maybe shouldn't be circulated in that way, or at least they shouldn't be, in a sense, harassed, maybe. But then you also have to think, like, well, in a sense, are they sort of doing that same thing to the public or to friends or to a certain group of people or whatever? So how does this relate to fan studies, though, in your experience?
Well, there have been historically, I say historically, in the last 10 years,
right,
a couple of instances of people wanting to study fans and trying to get information from them without doing so in the most ethical fashion. The most famous example of this are two researchers who were, at the time, I think they were at Boston University, and they wrote a book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. Their first names are Ogie and Cy. I forget their last names because, and they put out this survey, which a lot of people took. The survey itself had some triggering questions on it. The researchers were very unresponsive or strangely, their interactions with fans was very weird, let's say. And so fans started contacting their various universities, found out that they had no IRB approval for these studies. If you Google these guys, you'll find a lot of the various criticisms that were made of them. But they did publish their book, which was not an academic book, but a pop culture book. And it has, it is just egregious. I recommend that if you want to read it, you should pirate it because they do not deserve your money. Really, really egregious claims that they make about fans from a supposed neuroscience perspective. But it's all of the generalizations they make are based on the survey data that they got under very sketchy circumstances.
What was the title of it again?
A Billion Wicked Thoughts.
A Billion Wicked
Or a million? Probably a billion. I think it's a billion.
Okay, well, that's really interesting because I can't remember if it's you or if it's another author that I'm thinking of, but are you into One Direction at all?
Not so much. I see it. It comes up in my Tumblr feed, so I see it.
Okay, well, no, I was just asking you because I just went and saw the documentary This Is Us. And it's funny because I was really resistant, as I'm sure a lot of people have been, really resistant to them for years. And now, after seeing that, it's like this flood of, okay, well, now I have to, like, look into One Direction. But the thing that I find most interesting about them is not their fans, but how people view their fans, because I think I was sort of part of that, like, all One Direction fans are a certain way. And so, but my point is, in the documentary, they had this, like, 15-second clip where there was I'm not sure what he was, maybe a neuroscientist, maybe a psychiatrist, something scientist-y. And he was talking about the fact that, fans aren't crazy, and he sort of did a demonstration with, like, a brain and the chemicals going to this part of the brain, et cetera, et cetera. Huh. And he's like, the fans aren't crazy, they're just really, really excited because of this hormone that's released after they see whatever. And so it's just interesting that seems to often be, and while that's like sort of a positive statement, I guess, there is this need to classify fans, or I guess to pathologize, is that the word?
Yes.
I believe so, fans, as, if not being crazy, then at least being obsessive for this, and this logical reason, or illogical.
Absolutely.
I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
It's really interesting. If you look at, like, the history of fan studies, during the 90s, a lot of the research or the writing that was being done about fans, particularly when I say fans, I mean, like, people who are writing fan fiction and producing other kinds of fan works, was sort of aimed in this sociological direction, and with a lot of psychological and sociological direction, wanting to explain, why do people do this? What are they getting out of it? And particularly, the question that everybody wants an answer to, what is up with all of the women who like slash fic?
Right. Oh, God. Right.
So there are lots of, and this is even coming from, from researchers who were a lot more sympathetic. You get the work of people like Constance Penley, or even Henry Jenkins, to some extent. During the 90s, this was really the focus. Is how can we explain these people and why they're doing what they're doing? And then in the 2000s, there was sort of a turn, I think. There are more people wanting to talk about fan fiction as literature, and all of the literary qualities of it, and talk about the genre. And that was really cool, because you're sort of getting away from that, why are these crazy people doing these things, aim in research.
Yeah, and I've been trying to think of the article, but there was an essay written that I found on the Journal of Transformative Works, and I'll try to link it after this because I can't remember it for the life of me. But the author was talking about how, sort of going back to, like, with the Beatles and up till now with, say, Twilight or something like that, how it's always been this image of obsessive, usually shrieking or screaming young girls who are, like, simultaneously sexualized and desexualized and pathologized, like I just said. And it's just interesting to think of how that would compare to what's typically thought of as male fandoms, such as, you could say sports, but even things like that movie that came out a couple of years ago called Fanboys. I never saw it, but it was all about, like, Star Wars and those sort of quote-unquote geeky / nerdy fandoms that are usually attributed to having more male fans. I guess this is also similar in like gaming and things like that.
Yeah.
But just the image is just so different. I mean, while I guess a feminized version of fandom is sort of, you know, the emotional aspect of it, whereas a quote-unquote masculinized version is more sort of an obsession with logic and knowing facts and things like that, but it still has more of a comes from a place of knowledge about a certain thing rather than being emotional about a certain thing.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, so would you say, though, it kind of connects, but you talk a lot about, in your posts that I've seen, you talk a lot about fan shame, which is something that I really want to get into with this podcast, not only to sort of confront my own, but to just figure out, like, where does it come from and how is it expressed in certain ways, and I guess how can maybe people get over it if they want to get over it, which I'm all for getting over it, because, you know, for me, not only have I wanted to sort of look into fandom seriously in this way for a long time, but was sort of held back by that feeling of, well, it's not a real thing, you can't really research that, or you can't really make anything of it in your actual real life. And then there's also just that feeling of like, well, I also don't want to talk about it. You know, like I've asked people for advice in doing this podcast, and then you know, they ask what it's about, and it's kind of like I felt weird about saying what it's about, even though now I'll say it, but before it was like, you know, I call it like the fight club rule of fandom, where you don't talk about fandom. So I guess what's your personal history with, because I know you said that you lurked for a long time, but did that have anything to do with, I guess, the image of what a proper fan should be at the beginning of your fandom?
Maybe. I think it was about, I didn't think that I was a good enough writer, and I didn't like to be bad at things. I didn't like to fail, and so I didn't want to try and have a year or two where I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't very well prepared to think about myself as somebody who could grow and get better at things. But the other thing was, I think I still thought of fan works as something that you had to do sort of in secret, and it was sort of lesser than if I were writing about my feelings in my diary, or if I were writing original fiction, and it would be sort of this shameful secret that I had. And I'm glad that I grew out of that to some extent. I feel like there's different kinds of shame. There's a kind where it's sort of directed outward at people who are non-fans. And I've been trying particularly to talk about fandom more with like my family, my husband in particular, because it's a big part of my life, and I don't want to have this little shady in the shadows sense, that I don't talk to my best friends about. But there's also, so there's that. I get choosy about who I talk to about it. Like I don't, sometimes I'll bring it up with some work friends, sometimes I won't if I look at them and I'm like, you would not be down with this. Because it's always a pain when you have to have that conversation where they're like, but isn't that copyright infringement? But isn't that copying or stealing? And sometimes I can have that conversation. I am prepared and I'm jazzed up and energized and I can talk about it. And sometimes I'm like, fuck you, I don't want to talk about this. I don't need to defend myself. But then there's also those kinds of fan shame that are inside fandom, where there are certain kinds of fics that are okay, and some that aren't. And my go-to example about this is always the Mary Sue. And there's been a lot written, especially in recent, like the last 5-7 years, people kind of rescuing the Mary Sue and saying, wait, why can't we have really cool female characters, whether they're OFCs or they're just, female characters who were grabbing from canon and, I don't know, giving them a superpower, because we do that sort of thing with male characters all the time. And I've found, especially when I'm writing, before I started writing, I read mostly male-centric fics. When I started writing, I realized that I was most comfortable inside a woman's head. So I started writing a lot more female-centric fics, and I started reading a lot more of them too. The other kind of fan shame, I think, is stuff where we feel the need to apologize for things, like in author's notes, like, this is totally self-indulgent crap, and or this is wallowing hurt comfort all over the place. And because it's, fandom is all about those kinds of feelings, and celebrating them and digging into them and really taking them out of the shadows and seeing those feelings for the valid and wonderful and human aspects of them. But we still are like, I just wrote, I'm trying to think of something that I thought of as self-indulgent. Usually the ones that I think of as self-indulgent are ones where I have a really powerful character. I stuff that I've written in Merlin fandom, where I've made Merlin just like hugely powerful. But I get a thrill out of those. I love those. I love writing them. So I feel like I need to accept those.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I haven't even thought of how many different levels there are. I mean, I think the ones that stand out to me most probably have a lot to do with sexuality in terms of sexual orientation and, just as far as sexuality, especially female sexuality. But there really is so many, and then there's sort of, when you talk about, I guess, inter-fandom shame, maybe fan works are sort of, while they are fun and like in an ideal world, would be your own interpretation of whatever the text is that you're participating in. But it's also kind of a way to, or at least in my opinion, it's sort of a way to express not necessarily how much you know about it, but maybe how well you can adhere to either the canon or whatever the fanon is. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like if you have an idea or an interpretation of a character or whatever that is seen as being far outside of that, then it's sort of like there's more, I guess, more of a tendency to hesitate before you make something that would express that to other people. There's that, fear of like, well, no one's going to get this or no one's going to agree with me. Even though usually, I very rarely see people like comment on a fic or something and say like, oh, this is completely wrong, I disagree.
No.
People are super nice and understanding, and there's a lot of people who think the same thing and have been waiting for that thing to be made. But it's just like a sort of an internal thing where you limit yourself in that way because you don't want to be wrong about something, even though there's supposedly there's no wrong answers about any of this.
Right. I have a thing that I actually do. I like adding OCs to my fics to make the world feel more fleshed out. But I have a tendency to, particularly if the OCs are female, I make them younger or older than my characters, like significantly, so that they're not, so that, I don't know, I think I have a block about Mary Sue's in my head, like, that if I put in an OFC who's the same age as my characters and she's interesting and cool, then she's a Mary Sue, and I can't have that. And I should probably try and test my limits on that one and stretch out of my comfort zone. But
That's a good point. I've read a couple. It really has to be, an author that I trust, I suppose, for me to read something in which an OFC is included that's the same age, or especially if, like, she's a love interest, because, I mean, as quote unquote feminist as I have said that I am in the past, it still is like a block in my head.
Yeah.
Like I either there's some qualities that I find unrelatable, and so I just give up on the character, which makes no sense because there's unrelatable qualities about male characters. For instance, speaking of Teen Wolf, Jackson is absolutely one of my favorite characters, and he's so unrelatable to me. I'd hate him if I knew him in person. But it's like I don't have the same allowances for female characters as I do male characters. They either have to be the spitting image of me, or they have to be something that I aspire to be. But sort of in those in between places, I still can't quite get there for some reason.
Yeah, it's really difficult because, on the one hand, we've got the whatever you like is okay, we don't want to say to other people your kink is not okay or what you like is not okay, but we all grew up in this culture that makes us that formed our desires, and those desires, it's really unsettling to accept that my desires got formed, at least in part, by the sexist culture that I live in, and part of the things that I like are, powerful men and damsel ladies. I feel like I want to accept those desires on the one hand and also grow beyond them at the same time. It's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I'd of course love to keep talking about this all day, but we've talked a lot about sort of, I guess, academic fandom and that kind of thing. But I do want to ask you, what would you consider your current active fandoms? And maybe I should have asked you this at the beginning. I don't know, but and also, I guess, what's something that you're either reading or have watched recently, or some sort of fan work, or maybe community, even if it's not like something that's quote unquote an objective fan work, that you're into right now.
Ugh, okay, so I'm holding on desperately to Merlin fandom because I love that fandom. The show itself I had difficulty with sometimes, but it was a glorious fandom full of really beautiful, shiny people who wrote beautiful, shiny fics, and I'm going to be in it to the bitter end. I'm sort of in Teen Wolf. The last season was really hard for me. It caused me so much angst and anxiety and what the fuckery and actually I feel like I'm currently fandom shopping. I'm on the lookout for new fandoms. I really want to write in some new fandoms because I feel like I've been in Teen Wolf and Merlin for so long. I'm looking forward to the BBC is doing a whole bunch of new dramas next year, and I'm looking forward to Three Musketeers, or is it the Musketeers? Anyway, it's going to be a show next year, and we'll see if I like it. I tend to like historical settings in my TV canon. Let's see. So fan works that I'm currently interested in. Yesterday I watched a fan vid, Ghosts That We Knew by Green Silver. It's a Merlin fan vid. I watched it like 3 times because it's terribly sad, and it's sort of an overview of Arthur Merlin throughout the entire series, and it's heartbreaking and gorgeous, and it has all my feels in it, so let's see.
That's awesome. I've been trying to, I guess I really like that term, fandom shopping, because I've been trying to sort of get into Merlin for a while, and by trying, I just mean like seeing it on my dash and being like, I should watch that show, and then keep scrolling. But it's nice to know, though, that I think that's that's one of the draws. Like, even with Teen Wolf, I just started watching it maybe a month ago, but once again, it's one of those things that I've been resisting for so long, and then my friend was like, well, you also have to consider you're going to have, like, thousands of fic, like, new fic that you can read now, and that was what got me, and so...
Yes.
So that's sort of a new thing for me, but that's also a huge pool. Like, you know, if a fandom seems welcoming in some way, then I'm way more likely to go and see what that band or that TV show or whatever is about.
Yeah. Another great fandom that I really need to spend more time in is fandom. Fandom is wonderful, especially because they're very much into podfic. They have podfic out the wazoo, and
Yes.
it's all amazing.
And what bands, I guess, would you be interested in, or are you interested in?
Well, with fandoms, I think the main sources for fic are, let's see, you've Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, Panic at the Disco, and then there are a bunch of little bands that are sort of on the same record label as those guys.
I would say that I was just thinking about I guess sort of the My Chemical Romance fanworks, because that's been my, I guess, primary fandom for years and years and years. And I was thinking, you know, sort of, I guess, what is it that makes, I'm always thinking about what is it that makes this one thing have such huge fandom. And I think there's so many good fanworks that come out of the My Chem fandom because they're so, it's almost like the band themselves is like constantly writing their own fan fiction about themselves, and like every album that they come out with, and this is sort of like about Panic and Fall Out Boy too, maybe in lesser degrees, but every album that they come out with is sort of like a new reworking of what the band can be, and they have characters and stuff like that. So it's sort of like a really rich canon, I guess, that you can take whichever era that you like and sort of delve into that.
Yes, well put.
Yeah, but that's very true. There's so many things about fandom that I really miss. I haven't been reading any just because I haven't been into it in a couple months, and there's new things that I want to look into. But there's the amount of fic that comes out, you know, certain authors that have tons and tons and tons and tons of stories that I'm like, oh, why can't you just write this other person or this other show or whatever? And there's, I guess, tropes and stuff that exist in fandom that you wouldn't realize until you start reading in something else. But, awesome. So, are you working on anything new as far as fan fiction or anything?
Well, I just signed up for, I have no impulse control. I just signed up for both Teen Wolf Fall Harvest and Teen Wolf Holidays, which are 2 exchanges. I love exchanges. I really prefer, it's my favorite thing. I want to write for a specific person, for specific prompts, for a specific deadline. That is the way I would like all of my fan fiction to come out, and mostly exchanges happen at the end of the year. So
nice. So I guess we have something to look forward to maybe in the next couple of months.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it was so nice talking to you. There's so much stuff that I keep wanting to ask you, but it's okay. And my laptop's about to die anyway, so I guess this is a good point to close it out. But so thank you for being a part of the podcast. Hopefully we can have you back in the future. And awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. All right, have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.